And welcome back to Spiritual Strength. Today we're here with the great Robert Siscoe. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Really love your materials. Got your book, of course, True or False Pope, the website True or False Pope, with you and John Salza. So really great stuff. Anything new you're working on? I guess we'll start with.
Working on a book on ecclesiology.
Excellent.
Yeah, which is a
Excellent.
really important topic.
Yes, without a doubt, especially nowadays. So before we do a deep dive into the divine constitution of the church and everything, I'd like to get some of your background. Now, as we were just talking about this, at first you were sympathetic to the recognize and resistance movement in the SSPX, and then you moved away from it. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I converted to the Catholic Church back in '98 through the Society of St. Pius X. So I was 100% society initially.
Okay.
And then after about a year, I became aware of the excommunication. So I backed away just a little bit to look into that issue, started going to the indult mass. I was somewhat satisfied with what I read as far as the excommunications go. So I would attend the society occasionally and had no problem at all with the society until about 5 or 6 years ago, as I got deeper into the church, the divine constitution of the church, and then all the problems of society became glaringly obvious. So that's and that was after the book you're holding up, True or False Pope. Now that
That's what I was going to
book,
ask you. When you wrote this book, you were amenable to the recognize and resistance SSPX.
absolutely. Matter of fact, that book, there's just a few additional dots needed to be connected where kind of everything fell into place. The first two chapters of that book are really key. They lay out the divine constitution of the church, its marks, its attributes. It's just that there was kind of a blind spot to myself and also John Sauls where we didn't see the problems with the society, which are the society is not part of the Roman Catholic Church, to put it bluntly.
Right, which is very important, and we need that clarity, especially nowadays with all the great confusion. So now, would there be any changes that you would make to this? Like, as you said, there might be more dots you would connect, but was there anything in this book that you would actually change and say, no, this part was wrong, or
Very little. Maybe on the new mass, possibly we might have gone a little too far on that,
okay,
because the new mass actually has the traditional canon as Eucharistic prayer number one, the traditional canon. So to say there's no sacrifice, mention of sacrifice in the new mass, which Lefebvre said is completely false. So we might have gone a little bit too far on the new mass. But aside from that, really everything, I was actually surprised how accurate we are, especially on Bellarmine's opinion. As more was translated, we nailed Bellarmine's opinion exactly as he held it, with only a little bit of his translation to work with. So I'm actually surprised at how accurate some of the controversial issues turned out to be honest.
yeah, and praise God because it's been extremely helpful to many people on understanding where we're at. So, when we talk about the situation in the church today, a lot of people, I feel like they discuss it out of order. And we always want to discuss things in proper order. Aristotle said, the wise man puts things in order. And obviously, St. Thomas, looked at him as a great natural light. And most people tend to begin these arguments with, we're in a state of necessity. There's a crisis. A manifest pope can't be a heretic. The pope can't excommunicate tradition. Operation survival. And basically, they use that as now that's the starting point to proceed with their argument. And I feel like we're having a marathon discussion that we're beginning at mile 20, right?
Right, right. And in the midst of that, what's happened, there's been the rise of Protestant ecclesiology without
Yes,
anyone realizing it. So traditional Catholics have embraced Protestant ecclesiology without
exactly.
without realizing it.
And I feel like it's partially because they're jumping in at mile 20 with zeal and they're not realizing you don't start with the problem, you start with the divine constitution of the church. How did Jesus Christ establish this church when he lived? Do I have that right?
That's absolutely correct. That's it.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
with that being teed up, I'd love for you to take it from there.
Well, I've got a chart I drew up. I'll kind of show us. If you can, if I can get this in the screen, let me know if this is. What do you think? Is that
A little bit high, a little bit higher, a little bit closer.
okay?
There we go. Yeah, pretty good.
Okay. Okay, so we have here what Christ actually established when he was on earth. He established the primacy and the apostolic college.
Okay.
He established that when Christ said, going therefore teach all nations, baptize them in the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, he was conferring universal jurisdiction on the Episcopal College, The Episcopal College is the body of bishops in union with the Pope. That's the Episcopal College. And
Okay.
collegiality is simply the church's teaching on the Episcopal College.
Okay.
So that's the universal church that Christ established. Okay. Now you also have particular churches, which are dioceses. These Christ intended for the church to establish, but he didn't actually establish any. What he established is their form, monarchical. Okay.
Okay.
So as the church went out, it established local churches. Okay. So the members of the Episcopal College were then the heads of these local churches. So you have a unity of the body of all the bishops together with the Pope. That's the Episcopal College. And then throughout the world, they're establishing these local churches that are headed by members of this one body. And so now essentially the church is the local church of Rome, to which the primacy is attached, and all the dioceses are particular churches throughout the world in union with it. That's the Roman Catholic Church. That's what's indefectible. And so if you're simply put, if you're not a member of your local diocese, and if your diocese is headed by a man who's a member of the Episcopal College, you're not part of the universal church. The universal church exists within the particular churches. The particular churches are part of the universal church. If you're not part of your particular church, you're not part of the universal church. This is the structure of the Catholic Church. Again, the Church of Rome and the diocese throughout the world in union with it. That's the structure of the church. And this structure has 4 marks, one of which is apostolicity. Apostolicity is essentially, for the most part, it's the apostolicity in government, which is the apostolic college that Christ established. That will never defect. That will never defect, and therefore the churches, the local churches in union with Rome will never, they'll always be part of the universal church. You can have particular churches that defect, but that body of churches in union with Rome will always be the universal church.
Okay.
So
So now go ahead.
Yeah, do you have any questions?
Well, so I guess the first thing people would say is, so is that merely the government of the church? Is that just mere like man-made ecclesiastical law, or is that divine law? Because that's very important. Go
It's
ahead.
divine law. Ecclesiastical law are the territorial boundaries of particular churches. That's
Okay.
ecclesiastical law. So the church, like I live in Houston, Galveston. So territorial boundaries are ecclesiastical law. But the fact that our local bishop's the head of our local church is, he holds that by divine law when he's appointed to the office by the Pope. He holds it by divine law when he's appointed by the Pope. But the territorial boundaries are ecclesiastical law, and they can change. But this is the divine constitution of the church that will never defect. And outside of that church, there's no salvation.
And that's regardless of how good the intentions of the person. That's regardless of how well they may think they understand the church or the crisis in the church. That is the church that Jesus Christ established. And there's nothing that anyone can do that can change that, because he is the God-man.
Absolutely. So what we have now, we have the rise of Protestant ecclesiology. What is that? Protestant ecclesiology, the Calvinists taught that the church are all those who profess the true religion. So the church is no longer an institution. It's individuals who meet a certain definition. That is, all those who think they profess the true religion. And that's what you find in the traditional movement, especially among Sedevacantists. So the Sedevacantists, they belong to all these different sects, but they think they profess the true faith, so they think they're members of the church. You've probably heard that.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Hey, are we able to show my screen?
Let's see. Let me try to. Multiple participants can share simultaneously. Okay, I granted access. It should work.
Okay, so let's see if my screen's showing.
Not yet. Let's see again. Multiple participants, advanced sharing options. Nope, it says all participants. It should work.
Okay.
You click that arrow.
No.
Hmm.
Well, that's okay. I'll just read it. What
Yeah.
they base this on is Mystici Corporis Christi of Pius XII,
Right.
where he says actually only those are to be numbered among the members of the church who have been baptized, profess the true faith, and they usually stop right there, saying if you're baptized, profess the true faith, you're a member of the church. Matter of fact, the Diamond Brothers, they put a period right there, okay? But he continues on. Only those are numbered among the members of the church who are baptized, profess the true faith, and have not, to their own misfortune, separated themselves from the structure of the body, which is what I just showed you.
Right.
Or for very serious sins have not been excluded by lawful authority. For in one spirit, says the apostles, we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, whether bond or free. So just as in the true community of the faithful of Christ, there is only one body, one spirit, one Lord, as the Lord bids, let him be as the heathen and a publican. So there are one baptism, so there's only one faith. And so he refuses to hear the church as the Lord bids, let him be as a heathen or a publican. Here's the key sentence. Therefore, those who are divided from one another in faith or in government cannot be living the unity of such a body and in one divine spirit. So the structure of the body is a governing structure I just pointed to. So all the sedevacants are separated from the unity of the body. So they quote the first third of the sentence and leave out all the rest, which excludes them from the church. And that's Protestant ecclesiology. What do Protestants believe? That there's all these different denominations. The true church is pretty much all those within those various denominations who have the true faith, right? It's the same thing the sedevacants believe. Doesn't matter what sect you belong to, as long as you have the traditional mass, profess the true faith, you're a member of the church. Nope, not if you're separated from the unity of the body, from the governing structure.
Right. So that seems to be the consistent sleight of hand that people have to make to justify their position, either saying faith, being united in faith, sacraments, or governance, basically either downplaying one or just basically excluding the others.
They're excluding unity of government. That's the key. They exclude unity of government. Okay.
And that is,
go ahead.
I was going to say, and that is not merely ecclesiastical law. That is divine constitution of the church. That is divine law, which means Christ took into account every situation that could possibly ever happen throughout history.
Absolutely. No exceptions to divine law. So they'll say then that the Novus Ordo is not the true church, right? After Vatican II was perfected. But what that would mean, if you think about it, is not only that it's not the true church now, that would mean it wasn't the true church before Vatican II, because the true church is indefectible. You see?
Right.
So if that structure was the true church before Vatican II, it's still the true church now because the true church is indefectible. If it's not the true church now, that means the church before Vatican II wasn't the true church because the true church is indefectible. So they're kind of they don't really think this through, I don't think.
Right, exactly. And the marks of the church, one holy Catholic and apostolic, pertain to that juridical structure that you just showed there, that diagram.
Absolutely, because it has the apostolic hierarchy. And that church with the 4 marks also has the 3 attributes, or 4, depending on how you order them, which is visibility, indefectibility, and
infallibility.
Infallibility. Yeah, so the church with the 4 marks before Vatican II is also indefectible. Right. So you can't say it defected at Vatican II. If you do, then you're saying it wasn't the true church before Vatican II. But you can't say it had the 4 marks before Vatican II and defected, because the church with 4 marks is indefectible.
And that would include the faith as it's presented by the magisterium as indefectible. That would include the sacraments and the rites that are promulgated by the magisterium are indefectible, and also the governance, so the canon law, the ecclesiastical, that would also, and the structure is always
structure. That whole structure. Yeah.
Excellent. Talk about the attributes of the church more, because I really think that's where I think that's what's missing. And I know you already started talking about that, but keep going.
Really, probably the key one is infallibility. What does that mean? Infallibility is limited to what the church proposes as de fide, what it proposes as something that's the object of faith. Only what's been proposed definitively is the object of faith. So a pope can say something, wrong. That doesn't make it de fide. Only what's been defined is de fide. So you have a rule of faith. You have everything the church has defined over the centuries. That's one big rule of faith. It's all infallible. So the church can never take an error and make it part of that rule of faith. It can never define an error as something that's an object of faith. And there's been no errors defined since Vatican II. The problem is they extend infallibility beyond what the church teaches, and basically to include almost everything the Pope says, which is not, which is totally incorrect.
Right. Now, correct me if I have this wrong. When I look at infallibility, I'm kind of maybe looking at it as a broad blanket of the topic of general assent towards the magisterium. So infallibility, of course, to de fide statements. But I'm also kind of looking at under that attribute of infallibility, also things that aren't divinely revealed, but that have been taught by the church that require our religious assent of intellect and will. Am I right to blanket that in that category?
Sort of. Or requires religious assent is not infallible.
Right.
Yeah. So there's three propositions in the profession of faith. The first two, which are revealed truths that the church has definitively proposed as revealed, those are dogmas. Those require the assent of divine and Catholic faith. The next level is truths that the church has defined or proposed definitively, but not as revealed. Those also require the assent of faith, but it's not divine and Catholic faith, but it's the assent of faith. Then below that, you have non-definitive teachings, which are some of the teachings of Vatican II would fall into that category, but not everything in Vatican II would fall into that category. So those do not require the assent of faith. They require religious assent. The difference is the assent of faith is unconditional, firm, there's no questions. Religious assent, those can actually be wrong. There can be errors that require religious assent. That's why it's only religious assent, not the assent of faith. So that's kind of a key issue there. Religious assent is owed to non-infallible teachings because they can be changed. They can be revised in the future.
Okay. And now didn't Pope John Paul II, the same Pope John Paul II, say something about that there's a divine assistance with the church, this charism of safety, even with the teachings and the ecclesiastical laws, even if it isn't perfect or the best situation. Talk about that.
He didn't say safety. That they're taking Cardinal Franzelin's teaching.
Right.
That what he did say is that the Pope even has divine assistance when he's not defining a doctrine, and he does. Right. Cardinal Journet goes into this in detail. There's two species of divine assistance.
Okay.
One is infallible, one's fallible. The infallible is what Vatican I taught. So that divine assistance prevents the possibility of error. That happens when the Pope defines. But even when the Pope's not defining, he still has divine assistance, but it doesn't prevent the possibility of error. So popes can err, even though they have that divine assistance. So popes have erred when they've taught. So that's the difference. There's two species of divine assistance. One infallible, one fallible. The one John Paul II is talking about in the quote you're referring to is the fallible species of divine assistance. So popes can err.
Right, but that protection would guard that it wasn't like a heretical mistake, or no, we don't know.
No, the church has never taught that. People say that these days. Church has never taught that. There's just two species. One prevents error. One assists but doesn't prevent error, and the church has never said, but it prevents serious error. Church has never taught that. Okay. So, a pope might be able to say something heretical. Divine assistance doesn't prevent it unless he's defining a doctrine. You'll hear the contrary out there, but I'm telling you that's not correct. Church has never taught that a pope is unable to say something heretical when he's not defining a doctrine.
Okay. Now, where was Saint Robert Bellarmine? What were his opinions? Did he speak about these topics and the attributes of the church as well as this charism of safety, or however what did he say?
No charism. There was 5 different opinions he addressed in the famous Underbonic Pontifice chapter, book 2, chapter 30. The first opinion is out of Albert Pigius, and that's that a pope actually could err and could teach something heretical when he's not defining, but he couldn't fall into formal heresy, so he couldn't lose the faith. But that opinion also teaches that the Pope could err even heretically when he's not defining, but he couldn't adhere to it. He could, by mistake, basically. He could say something heretical by mistake without adhering to the heresy. That's the opinion of Albert Pigius. So Bellarmine held to that. He didn't think a Pope could lose the faith, adhere to a heretical proposition. He didn't think that. But he also said that opinion is only probable. He qualified as probable, which is a very low grade of certitude. And he also said the common opinion is that a pope can fall into personal heresy. So in the same sentence, he said, basically, he adheres to Pigius' opinion. He says it's probable and pious. And he says, but the common opinion is the opposite, which is that a pope could fall into heresy. So if you hear someone saying Bellarmine said a pope couldn't fall into heresy, yeah, he held that as a probable opinion. And again, probable is the lowest grade of certitude. Common opinion's higher. He admitted the common opinion was that he could fall into heresy, just to clarify that point.
Okay. And if any other the saints or any doctors of the church after that where Pope spoke about that?
No, but a lot of theologians since that time have held that it's probable that a pope can't fall into personal heresy formally. But I know of no one who's qualified it more than only probable. Even Cardinal Bio, he has a long defense of that proposition, the pope can't fall into formal heresy. But at the end, he qualifies as probable. That's a low grade of certitude. So it's possible a pope could fall into heresy. And church has definitely never ruled that out.
Okay, so then because then a lot of times you'll see traditionalists, they'll take that and they'll try to drive a bus through that and say, well, that's why we can't, we gotta follow the faith.
Well, just because a pope could fall into heresy doesn't mean you're on your own private judgment. You rely on your private judgment. For example, the Society of St. Pius X and all traditionalists reject collegiality. Collegiality, as taught by Vatican II, is 100% traditional. It would have been taught in Vatican I, but the council was cut short. So based on their private opinion, they reject collegiality, taught not only by the Pope, but by an entire council, and approved by a vote of 2,515 to 5. That was approved. So they're wrong for rejecting that teaching, even though theoretically, I wouldn't go so far as to say a council could approve something to that degree that was heretical. I don't think that would be possible. But point is, you still can't rely on your own private judgment just because it's possible a pope could fall into heresy.
Okay, and then a lot of people will they'll hold up figures like Saint Athanasius or Saint Joan of Arc or I think maybe Saint Catherine. I don't know. There's several people they keep using over and over. Can you talk about any of those examples and how they stayed within the bounds of the juridical structure that you showed?
Absolutely. Saint Athanasius, he was exiled 5 times. Okay, exiled 5 times. And guess what he did each and every one of those times? He obeyed. He obeyed. He went through the proper channels to challenge it, but he obeyed every single time. He never set up his own church on the side and said this is unjust. He obeyed. That's the difference between Athanasius. He also defended the Pope, Liberius, who actually declared him excommunicated and held communion with the Arians. Athanasius defended him. So he didn't turn on the Pope who wavered in the faith, but somebody else did. And that was Lucifer of Cagliari. He was a good guy at the time. He was one of Athanasius' friends. He was a good guy defending the faith, but he went too far. And he then turned on the church. He called the church a whore. He called the church a harlot. He turned against the church. And it began with an illegal episcopal consecration. He consecrated one of his associates, Paul of someone. He consecrated him bishop. When that bishop wasn't accepted by the other bishops, he turned on the church. Isn't that interesting? So he pretty much died in schism, but the point, he turned against the church. Athanasius didn't do that. He stayed within the framework of the church. He stay within the framework. He challenged the when he was banned, he challenged those, but he never disobeyed. So that's a key difference between Athanasius and Lefebvre and the other so-called traditionalists.
Okay, yeah, and we hear people say it's like, well, there's been many bishops who've consecrated another bishop without a papal mandate, but talk about how that's very different than doing it against an explicit papal mandate.
Not only that, but before Trent, a papal mandate wasn't required. Patriarchs were allowed to choose bishops. Even emperors were allowed to choose bishops. At Trent, it changed that. It restricted it to the Pope approving the bishops. But again, when they consecrated these bishops, they weren't just making a bishop. They were consecrating a bishop for an apostolic see. So the bishop died. They consecrated a bishop for that office, for that particular church. Lefebvre just consecrated bishops with no office in the church. All these traditional bishops have no office, no title. They're just roaming vagus bishops. That's one difference. So they'll defend their consecration by saying, well, back in this age in 1200s, during a vacancy of the papal see, they consecrated a bishop. Well, that's because a patriarch was allowed to choose and consecrate bishops. So he consecrated the bishop for a vacant see, which he was allowed to do. Can't do it after Trent, especially after Pius XII, but even after Trent. The 1917 Code of Canon Law suspends anyone who consecrated the bishop without a papal mandate. Pius XII added excommunication to that. So it's never allowed after Trent.
Yeah, and it would seem like that's always assuming that because it's presumed that the Pope approves what the bishop is doing. If they, that's like an
yes,
right.
Yeah, the Pope, the Patriarch had permission of the Pope to consecrate bishops.
Right.
To choose and consecrate. It was tacit permission by the Pope.
Right.
Matter of fact, some of it is kind of a different subject, but the Eastern Patriarchs, even though I said Trent forbade that, the right of consecrating bishops was never, as far as I know, if what the canonists say, never explicitly taken away from some of the patriarchs in the East. So because of that, some canonists say that when they appoint bishops, they're appointing them to legitimately established episcopal sees, that they actually get ordinary jurisdiction, which is an interesting, kind of complicated topic. But it's interesting to note the Pope never officially took that right away from some of the patriarchs in the East.
Okay. And now, yeah. And who are some of the other people that a lot of times traditionalists will hold up as, well, they were disobedient when in fact they weren't?
Athanasius is the biggie.
I think I've heard St. Joan of Arc before.
Yeah, but that was a local bishop. That was a local bishop. She wasn't disobedient. I mean, she was excommunicated and burned at the stake, but she wasn't disobedient.
Okay.
No, but it wasn't the Pope. That was a local bishop. Other examples, can you think of any? Athanasius is the biggie.
Yeah, that's the big one they hold up and saying Archbishop Lefebvre is the Athanasius of our time. Yeah. You always hear that.
Yeah, he wasn't. Yeah, Athanasius didn't set up a parallel church. Archbishop Lefebvre, the Society of St. Pius X, it was initially set up as part of, so if we get the chart back.
Yep.
So
break out the handy dandy chart. Yep, there it is.
So he was originally set up as what's called a pious union under a diocese. He was set up on a 6-year ad experimentum basis. If everything goes good for 6 years, we'll approve for another 6 years. If everything goes good after that, you get fully approved. Well, before that 6 years was up, his society was suppressed. Okay. But it was never a universal diocese. He never had the right to consecrate bishops, to send priests out to open up churches, just to form priests, just a seminary. So when it was suppressed, Archbishop Lefebvre, first of all, said it was illegally suppressed, which isn't true. But even if it would have been, 1 year later, his approval expired. So he wouldn't have existed. But even if it was illicit, unjust suppression, that doesn't mean he had the right to consecrate bishops or to ordain priests. He only had the right to train priests. He had to get a dismissory letter from the bishop, say that they'd be incarnated under their bishop. Then Archbishop Lefebvre would train them and they would go back to work for their bishop. So archbishops started ordaining priests and setting up chapels throughout the world, a parallel church and other bishops' dioceses. So that's totally illicit. Everything's illicit about it. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Now you brought up the concept of having, he didn't have mission, right? And a lot of times they'll say, oh, extraordinary mission. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, extraordinary mission. He didn't have any mission. He didn't have a title. He actually was titular bishop of a see, but he didn't have the ordinary jurisdiction over the society where he could then incarnate priests. So no priest could be incarnated underneath him. Extraordinary mission is mission you receive directly from Christ. So normally it's canonical mission, right? But sometimes there can be an extraordinary mission like St. Vincent of Ferrer. He received an extraordinary mission directly from Christ to go out and preach. But whenever there's an extraordinary mission, there has to be some type of way to know there's an extraordinary mission. So canonical mission, you know that's received through the canonical structure. Extraordinary mission requires something to show it, and that's divine testimony of miracles. Miracles always required for extraordinary mission. Anyone can claim to have been sent by Christ. You have to have miracles to back it up. Not only that, Christ is never going to send someone outside the structure of the church, right? Always going to be within the structure of the church.
Even an extraordinary mission, you're saying?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
Never going to be sent out outside the structure of the church, always within. Vincent Ferrer, that was a difficult situation. there were multiple popes, but he was still within the general structure of the church.
Right, right. And that's those are important distinctions, little nuances right there, because
Yep.
again, people will take that and then twist it to mean something different.
And I don't think the society even claims to have extraordinary mission. That would require that every single priest is out performing miracles left and right to justify being sent directly from Christ. They don't claim to have been sent by Christ. They don't even make that claim. So really, it's not even an issue. They don't
And
claim to be.
but you hear supply jurisdiction a lot, right? And the salvation of souls is the highest priority of canon law, which it is, of course.
It
But
is, but
talk about how supply jurisdiction just doesn't apply to this case.
well, the one thing is souls aren't saved by leaving the structure of the church. So they can say salvation of souls. They're not saving any souls by drawing them outside of the church, convincing that the true church is now a false church. You don't save souls by doing that. Supply jurisdiction, there's three conditions for supply jurisdiction, or three triggers that trigger supply jurisdiction. One of them is danger of death. So if an excommunicated priest goes up on a traffic accident, someone's dying, he's a Catholic, the church gives that priest jurisdiction to hear his confession. Without jurisdiction, confession is invalid, even a valid priest. So the church supplies jurisdiction in that extraordinary case because salvation of souls is the highest law of the church, right? The other trigger is common error. Common error is, it's generally believed by those who have the knowledge to make this judgment that the priest has ordinary faculties. Everyone believes he has ordinary faculties. Say a society priest snuck into a church at the regular confession time, people saw a priest in the confessional, they would assume that's the priest with jurisdiction. In that case, the church would supply jurisdiction because of common error. Society says we don't have no ordinary faculties, but the church will supply anyway because of common error. No, the common error is that the priest has ordinary faculties. They say the common error is that the church will supply in spite of them having faculties. See, that's the difference. Common error, the priest has faculties. The average person would believe that. They say, no, the priest doesn't have faculties, but the church will supply anyway. So there's an error in the object of common error. You see what I mean? There's an erroneous judgment on what the common error needs to be. It's not that the church will supply because we're in a crisis. It's the common error is that everyone, a normal person would believe that priest has normal faculties. He's the regular priest of the diocese. He was sent by the bishop. That's common error. The other one is positive and probable doubt. A priest is in the confessional. He's not sure if the faculty he has would apply in this case. He confessed maybe abortion, and the priest isn't sure if he can absolve. If he has positive and probable doubt that he can absolve that sin, then the church will supply. Those are the three conditions.
Okay,
None apply to the society.
has nothing to do with, there's confusion or ambiguity or crisis in the church. Nothing at all to do with that.
Nope. Christ in the church, I've got probably 5 different options for confession I can go to in any day. There's plenty of options for confession.
Right.
There's no necessity.
Yeah. Now, and then one of the things that a lot of people will say is, well, we're in an absurd situation because we have, you could go to confession. The Pope granted confession faculties to hear confession to the SSPX as an extension of mercy, not as the best case scenario. So right. Talk about that a little bit. So, if I go to confession there, I can't stay the extra 5 minutes and go to mass. Apparently you can't.
No, you can't, because the priest doesn't have faculties to say mass. So the mass is illicit. So the Pope can give faculties for confession. He has universal jurisdiction. He can give them to the old Catholics. He can give it to whoever he wants. And he did. He gave the society priest faculties for confession and for marriages under certain conditions. So you can go to the society priest not for confession. He has faculties, but he doesn't have permission or authority to say mass. He's not incarnated under a bishop. So his mass is illicit, no doubt about it. And if anybody doubts it, write to Rome with a dubia and say, are the society masses listed? Can I fill my Sunday obligation? Write to Rome and ask them. That's how you handle a situation. Like, for example, switching gears, the whole Benedict is still the Pope issue, he used the wrong word. He used ministerium instead of munus. So everyone's arguing about, is he still Pope? Is he not? How does a Catholic answer that question? What do you think? How would a Catholic answer that question? He'd write to Rome. Ratzinger used the word ministerium instead of munus. Does that invalidate his resignation? Rome replies, that's how a Catholic answers it. You don't go listen to somebody on YouTube to find out the answer to that. You write to Rome. I don't think anyone did that. Same thing with society. Write to Rome and ask them, or your local bishop.
Right. And it seems at various points in history, for different reasons, the popes have tolerated the Orthodox to be able to provide certain sacraments for Catholics, and vice versa, as a toleration, of course. Um,
Right.
so
Yes.
it's so right off the bat, it can't be intrinsically evil or wrong. Like the church can't do that. Of course, the church can do that.
Right. That's right. Can't permit them to go to mass at a different, like the Orthodox. Yes, that's right. In extreme cases, the church has permitted that.
But the church
Highest,
must say that.
right. It has to say that. Exactly. Yes, that's right.
Excellent. And then I also look at that structure that you have there, the church, right? And I think about Eucharistic ecclesiology, which of course became bigger around Vatican II, and how we all partake of the one loaf, right? And then in the New Testament, we partake of the one loaf, and that one loaf is celebrated by the Pope, and our connection to the Pope is through our bishop. Talk about that a little bit.
What does Jerome say about that? Eat not the lamb outside the church, or you eat it unto death, or something. So if we take of the one loaf, that's unity within the church. It doesn't mean if you eat the bread outside the church, there's unity. No, that's total. That's a new ecclesiology. I don't think that was after that. That's a recent ecclesiology, because everything's based on the mass. You see, unity is in the mass and profession of the true faith. So because it's all about the mass, it makes perfect sense. You would have a new false ecclesiology that says it's the unity of the Eucharist, right? If you partake of the Eucharist, there's the church. No, that's again the governing structure of the church.
Right.
So yes, that would mean then that the old Catholics, you can go to mass of the old Catholic sect because they have the true mass. No, it's unity within the church, unity within the body. The Holy Ghost is the soul of the one body, the one governing structure. There's unity within that body. You eat the lamb outside the church, you're eating it to your own destruction,
Right.
just as Jerome says.
Right. And I guess I'm backpedaling a little here, but thinking about those attributes of the church, the infallibility, indefectibility, and the visibility, how they're interdependent on one another. That like basically they all work together. They're dependent on one another, right?
Exactly. That's right. Just like the marks are all independent, so too are the attributes. They all work, they're all interdependent, interrelated, interdependent.
Right.
So the
Because what
visible
good would it be? What good would it be to have an infallible church if we can't identify it visibly?
That's it. That's right. And the way you identify it is the formal visibility or the marks of the church. That's what makes the church identifiable as a true church, or formally visible. Formally visible is what you know, like material visibility, what I see. Formal visibility is what I know. How do I know the church is the true church? Because it has the four marks. The only church that can have the four marks is the one consisting of the local Church of Rome and all the dioceses in union with it, because apostolicity requires bishops with ordinary jurisdiction. The only bishops with ordinary jurisdiction are bishops in charge of particular churches in union with the Church of Rome, bishops who are appointed by the Pope. So those are the only ones that can have ordinary jurisdiction, those appointed by the Pope. So yeah.
No, it makes sense. And
Yeah.
good. And anything else to add to that? Good.
Yeah, the only church that can have the four marks is the one that everyone calls a conciliar church, or the Vatican II sect. All those names refer to one and the same thing, which is the Roman Catholic Church, the Diocese of Rome, and all the churches throughout the world in union with us. So the Christ is the church now. Who's going to be able to keep the faith? Who's going to keep the faith and stay within the church? Bishop Williamson, he left the church. He founded his own sect. And he thought that his sect had the four marks. He actually thought his sect had the four marks. Founded in the year 2012, which is 1979 years too late, right? 1979 years, if my math is right.
Yeah.
That's when he founded his sect. So he doesn't have the four marks. So he, unfortunately, Bishop Williamson, along with Bishop Tessier de Malaray, died outside the church. They died outside the conciliar church. What's a conciliar church? It's that church.
That structure.
That structure. That's the conciliar church. That's the Vatican II. So you can call it what you want, but it's the Roman Catholic Church, one and the same thing.
Right. And when people set up this phantom of the true church or the false church, the conciliar church, there's only one church. There's no other.
The true church is the same place it's always been. It's a Diocese of Rome and all the particular churches in union with it, just like it was before Vatican II, because that church is indefectible. You go outside that church, you're going to have division, you're going to have splits, the resistance from the society. Right. It immediately split into other sects, warring sects with each other. The society has ordained about 1,400 or 1,500 priests. They have 700. Where'd the other 700 go? They're out in their own sects. Some, the smart ones, return to the conciliar church. The wise ones are back in the Catholic Church. The rest of them are scattered in their own little sects. And they think that all their sects combined is the true church. No unity of government. It's just like Protestantism.
Right.
I don't know how the light's going to go off for them. It went off for me, thankfully. But I don't know how it's going to go off for them. But they're definitely outside the church. Society is outside the church. They have jurisdiction for confession. That's great. Maybe some of their faith will go to heaven because of that. But they're outside the church. They need to open their eyes and realize that.
Right. I mean, I think it's, the prayer, and then also looking at it as really intellectual honesty, questioning some of our questioning some of our first principles, basically our assumptions that just because there's a crisis, that doesn't negate that. That's why you want to talk about the divine constitution before you talk about any problem and establish this is divine law.
And I got to admit, I had that mentality maybe 10 years ago when I would go on. I go out of town a lot for work. When I was out of town, I'd pull up the Traditio directory, find any priest said the old mass. That's where I went to mass. It was outside the church. I didn't see it either. It's clear as a bell now, but I didn't see it. Just like they don't see it. So, I mean, if anything I can do to help them out, I'd like to do that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's why I wanted to have you on with this, because you explain it really well. John explains it really well, also solves us. So it's important that we make this more available to people so they see it too. So I guess after you have that and we establish this is the divine constitution of the church, it can change. Obviously, Christ took into account any situation that could possibly happen. It's not going to circumvent divine law. Now, all that being said, how do we deal with issues that arise in the church, and how do we discuss any crisis in the church without jumping ship and sounding like a schismatic wacko?
Well, I need some examples. If you look at just practically speaking, I've got some great masses around my area. I got to drive a little bit, but practically speaking, if there was no internet and I just went to mass at these churches, I wouldn't even know there's a crisis. I got confession. I got multiple confessions near me every day. I've got a beautiful mass downtown Houston. They even say the Novus Order, like the traditional mass, which is not problematic at all. So it's really, most of it's coming from the internet, what you're reading. A lot of stuff that you're reading is not true. A lot of things are twisted and spun. It's just like just criticism, constant criticism, looking for anything to criticize, which scandalizes Catholics. How bad is it really, practically speaking? If you have a good mass to attend on Sundays or daily mass, how bad is the crisis? How bad does the crisis really affect you, aside from reading about everything on the internet? Probably not very much.
Right. And I think a lot of times though, you see things like when you watch back videos of Assisi, or you see the Pacha situation that came up, which it seems like Michael Lofton has largely debunked that's not even what was actually going on there, but people see that. So how do we, what do people do?
The first thing to do is look in. I'll give you an example. I read, there was an article. It was titled "Francis Betrays Christ to the Muslims." Thinking, okay, what happened this time? So I read the article. I dug into it. So this is what it was. Right, the substance was this: Francis went somewhere and gave a speech. Okay, and where he gave the speech, whoever decorated the room didn't put a crucifix in that room. So that was Francis betraying Jesus Christ. He didn't decorate that room. He wouldn't give a speech, but it was spun to where Francis betrays Christ because he gave a talk in a room, in an auditorium where someone didn't put a crucifix. I mean, things are spun. So first of all, look into things. When you look into them, a lot of the stuff I looked into, it's not nearly as bad as you think. Sometimes it's reversed. So something that's good is presented as bad. You even see that sometimes. So don't just believe any headlines you read. Look into it.
Right. Because at first glance, you look at something like Assisi or the Pachamama thing, and it looks really bad on the surface.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of Assisi. I still say it. I'm not a fan of Assisi, but that was what, 40-something years ago?
Right.
Got time to move on. That was 40-something years ago. So John Paul II did Assisi 40-something years ago. Why does that bother? Why am I worried about that?
Well, and also, isn't there that one pope who pinched incense to the god Jupiter?
Marcellinus. Yeah,
right.
He gave incense to the gods, to Jupiter. That's right.
Right. And what happened to him? He stayed the pope, right?
That's right. They held a council. And They still recognize him as Pope because they said the first see's judged by no one when he came in there. Judge yourself, they said. So he basically resigned. Major humility. He was in sackcloth and ashes, I believe. He showed sackcloth and ashes. He resigned, and they reelected him Pope, and then he died as a martyr. So it turned out good.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And now what about, now there were some popes like throughout history, and again, relatively very, very few that okay, they fathered children while they were the pope.
Absolutely.
And now that
Absolutely.
you could see that'd be even a much greater scandal if that were to happen today. How
I would,
how do when we see that, what do? We look at that, well, that's him as a private person.
it's scandalous.
Right.
So bad popes are a scandal. When you have bad popes, you're going to have Catholics losing the faith, and you're going to have heretics pointing to the scandal to scandalize Catholics so that they'll lose the faith. So bad popes are a scandal, no doubt about it. God permits it. So Bellarmine addresses that. He addresses all these bad popes, according, and also Alexander the Sixth he referred to. He says, why does God allow? He says, assuming all this is true about these popes, why does God allow it? Why does he allow these bad popes, these scandalous popes? What's his answer? To show Catholics that it's not the Pope who saves the church. It's the Holy Ghost who preserves the church in spite of these popes. See that?
Where did Bellarmine write that? So I
He
could.
wrote that in the introduction to, I think, De Remana Pontifice. He
Okay.
addresses the scandalous popes. Why does God allow it? It's to show Catholics that it's not the Pope. It's not the Pope who preserves the church. It's the Holy Ghost who preserves the church in spite of bad popes.
Right.
Because the efficient cause of indefectibility, the efficient cause of this structure not defecting isn't a Pope, as Mario
Right.
Bertson Nova Thora Watch falsely says. It's the Holy Ghost. He's the soul of the
Right.
church. Christ
Right.
had a mission, right? Christ's mission was to redeem mankind, establish the church. The Holy Ghost also has a mission, and it's to preserve the church. So to say that church defected is to say the Holy Ghost failed in his mission.
Right. Right. And I
And
guess it would go ahead.
that's the point Bellarmine was making in that. He allows bad popes to show that the Holy Ghost will preserve the church in spite of those popes.
Yeah, and I guess then it would fall under the same thing with, because I guess it's easier to chalk it up to a bad pope, but then if you have someone who appears to be a good pope, like St. John Paul II, and then you see him kiss the Quran, people in their minds, all of a sudden they say, oh, he's lost the faith, he's apostatized. No, he might have just done something that he shouldn't have done.
Yeah, he probably maybe regretted it. Kiss the Quran. I don't know why he did it. I wouldn't have done it.
Right,
But we do have. I've done a lot of things I regret.
right,
He regretted
right.
it.
That doesn't mean he was teaching Catholics also to distinguish. That doesn't mean he was teaching Catholics to now you have to go by the Quran.
Exactly right. Yeah. So
Right.
yeah, there's too much. Also too much focus on the Pope. Everything's focused on the Pope. Everything the Pope does is under a microscope. Anything that they can spin to make it look bad is fun to make it look bad. You know.
Right.
He's just a person. He has a charism of infallibility. Now, the infallibility, just to back up a little bit,
Yeah.
there's conditions. So the charism is only enact when the Pope's defining. The Pope's not defining a doctrine extra, it's not enact. The negative charism infallibility, it's not even enact. I'm getting that from Bishop Gasser's Relatio during Vatican I. He explained the dogma the father's going to be voting on. He said it's not even enact the charism unless he's defining a doctrine ex cathedra. The other general assistance is always there, just like a father has a general assistance from God to raise his kids. Bishops have the general assistance from God to run their diocese. The Pope has also more of an assistance from God in governing the church, but he only has the negative assistance preventing error when he defines the doctrine ex cathedra. That's how John the 22nd could have professed publicly that the souls of the faithful departed would not enjoy the beatific vision until after the general judgment. He was dead wrong. He still had that divine assistance. How was he able to be so wrong? He was just wrong because it's not a negative assistance. It doesn't prevent the possibility of error. He was still getting actual grace, I assume, to show him that he's wrong, but he didn't follow it. The next pope then defined the contrary of what John the 22nd taught. So popes can err.
Right, and along with the Pope not always being infallible, the Pope is not always exercising his teaching office every time the Pope speaks, it's not an act of the authentic or just merely ordinary magisterium. He just might be speaking as a private person.
This is another huge point that I've been digging into this issue for the last 7 years deeply as much as I can, reading everything I can find on it. And in the past, from least at the time of Bellarmine for sure, and a little after him, the Pope was only considered as teaching as Pope when he defined a doctrine ex cathedra. If he was not defining a doctrine ex cathedra, he was teaching as a private person. Now, that's not actually, it's not actually correct, because a Pope can teach as a private person. He can also teach as Pope non-definitively. But the point is, he was only looked at as teaching as Pope when he defined a doctrine ex cathedra. Matter of fact, Gregory the 16th and his book Triumph of the Holy See was written before he was elected Pope, but then a third edition was republished under his papal name after he was elected Pope. He talks about two ways the Pope can teach. He can teach as Pope when he's defining a doctrine. He can teach as a private person. But then he makes the distinction in two ways a Pope can teach as a private person. One of them is teaching as a private person, like we would think, writing a commentary, private commentary. Another one is teaching the church in a way that requires religious assent, but not definitively. He called that the Pope teaching as a private person. Did you hear that?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
He qualified that as Pope teaching as a private, even though he's teaching the church and requires religious assent, he called it the Pope teaching as a private person because, like I said, the Pope was only looked at teaching as Pope when he defined doctrine ex cathedra. There's been development since then. There's really three ways the Pope can teach, but the bottom two were a private person, only defining ex cathedra was teaching as Pope. That's an interesting point.
Yeah. What other books or resources are good to look at with that?
Bellarmine talks about that. Pope Celestine, he says that Celestine erred. He taught that there was a woman whose husband left her, apostatized, and so she met another man, and she got permission to marry the other man. First, there was no question about the validity of her original marriage. She was allowed to marry the other man. Celestine was asked to comment on that. He said basically, after that, her original husband returned to the faith and wanted his wife back. Okay, now we got a quagmire. So it's sent to the Pope. What do we do about this? Celestine said, no, she should stay with her new husband, not return to her original husband because he apostatized. She should stay with her new husband. Now, Innocent II, 50 years later, taught the contrary. No, she should have gone to her original husband. He taught the contrary. But the point being, Bellarmine said that was Celestine. This was a dubia. The Pope was sent a dubia. He replied from his office. Bellarmine said that's just him giving his opinion as a private person. Isn't it interesting?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
You have also Nicholas I, who said that baptism in the name of Jesus or in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost is valid. That's a problem. The name of Jesus is not valid.
Right.
He wrote this to the Bulgars in 865. This was an official writing from the Pope. What does Bellarmine says? He's just teaching as a private person. Private person. This was in the act of his office. He wrote this. So Bellarmine discusses this, teaching as a private person. So if you have his books online, the e-edition, just put private person or private doctor, see what pops up and see what Bellarmine says about it. That's one way to look into it.
Wow. So that would play into, obviously, we were saying before about the divine assistance and that charism of safety, right? That okay, it might be a little bit more like with it when you look at that, it's a little bit messier than it might appear to be than you'd want it to be.
Yes, the charism. Let me address the charism of safety. That comes from Cardinal Franzelin. Cardinal Franzelin came up with a theory. Came from Franzelin in 1875, the second edition of his book. He came up with the idea that a doctrinal decree, not just the Pope saying something, but a doctrinal decree of the Pope will be infallibly safe, even if it's not infallible. Okay, just a doctrinal decree, not everything the Pope says, a doctrinal decree. That's what
infallibly safe, meaning not that necessarily it's the best framed or absolute, but just that it won't contain heresy or send you to hell.
Exactly. But the point is,
a low bar. Go ahead.
Yes, he limited it to directly doctrinal decrees, not even practical decrees, not even things that he allowed in practice. Explicit doctrinal decrees, meaning I believe this, directly believe this, a doctrinal decree. He limited it to doctrinal decrees, which nobody ever talks about. They just mentioned Franzelin said infallible safety, and they imply it means everything the Pope says, regardless of the context. No, it's doctrinal decrees only. He limited it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And then is that getting, so is that whole concept being misapplied more now? Is that an
Yes.
is it an overreaction to stay in the church? What are your thoughts?
Um, it's the purpose. It's definitely expanding it way beyond what it. They're expanding the infallibility of the Pope way beyond what the church has taught. I'm sure they have good intentions. Their intentions, I'm sure, are to say, look, you have to believe what Francis taught, and you can believe it because it's infallibly safe. Therefore, whatever he teaches, you have to believe it. See, but the
Or even
problem,
if it's wrong, it's not going to be heretically wrong.
right?
Or is that a distinction that doesn't really even merit?
That's what they'll say. That's what
Okay.
they'll say. Yeah, it's safe to believe. But the problem is when you go too far, there's always reactions the opposite direction. They're going to
Right.
say, well, hold on, Francis is infallibly safe, but he's taught this, which I don't think is infallibly safe. Therefore, it must mean he's not the Pope. That's what's going to happen. And that's what does happen. I've seen people draw a conclusion. So everything's infallibly safe, but Francis said this, which isn't infallibly safe, I don't think. Therefore, I conclude he's not the Pope. See, that's what happens. That's the unintended consequence of that error. You never go too far. Whatever the church teaches, stick with that. If you want to know what the church teaches, pick up any old manual, any old theology manual. They're all online. Read what it says. Read how it explains papal infallibility. Perfect. They explain them all the same way. What he defines ex cathedra is infallible. Period. And it has to be. There has to be internal and external intention to define. What does that mean? That means he has to intend to define, and he has to manifest the intention to define. If it's not clearly manifest, it's not infallible. It's not. It doesn't qualify as infallible. So
Right.
internal and external intention to define. Only that is infallible. If it's
Right.
not that, it doesn't fall in teaching of Vatican I.
Right. So it's not infallible, but we still have to have religious submission of intellect and
Absolutely.
will. That yeah.
Yeah, think about it. Think about it. You go to college, okay? Are you gonna not believe anything the professor says because it's not infallible? No, you assume he's probably right, so you believe him. Same thing with the church. You assume it's probably right. Now, if he comes out and says there's two persons in the Trinity,
Well, yeah,
obviously there's a problem there.
yeah.
But yeah, but normally you assent to what they say. Normally you assume that they're right. And that's all religious assent is.
Well, because the knee-jerk reaction is when you see like a fiducia supplicans where it's oh well can you bless a gay couple or a mors laetitia can civilly divorced and remarried
But if
or
you
can the Latin mass be suppressed? Yeah, and like if
right,
at first you say wait or the death penalty
no,
now it's impermissible. So you look at all
yeah,
those situations, you're
right,
like, golly,
yeah,
that doesn't seem Catholic, but
right, yeah.
so, but we're supposed to conform to the manifest mind of the Pope, and it seems to be. I mean, I guess when you read it, you could finesse it to mean to have
Right.
an orthodox meaning. But what's your take on all that?
Right, definitely. I dig into those. So if you look at the blessing of the gay couple, if you actually read that document, okay, you read that document for what it says, all the qualifications, you'd have to conclude that's probably okay. Because all kinds of qualifications, well, good intentions, you'd have to conclude that's probably okay because it's not blessing the union, it's
Right,
blessing the individuals. So
and they're clear about that. He's clear
so
about that. Yeah.
if you read the document itself, now what they're going to say is, well, they're just trying to open the door. But if you read the document itself closely, you'd probably agree that it's okay.
Right,
Um,
and misuse doesn't negate proper use.
right. And Amoris Laetitia, if you read that very carefully, if you read it for what it says, okay,
Right,
go to the problematic section, read one line at a time, what it says, not what it doesn't say, but what it
right,
says.
right,
It's actually okay. It's perfectly fine. You have to read what it says
right.
carefully because one of the problems you have today is things look like they say one thing, but they really don't. So that's just part of the trial that we're in right now.
Right. And
Things
then
look,
go ahead.
if you look at it carefully, what is it actually saying? Like a Morse Laetitia, I went through that one line at a time, and it's perfectly fine if you take it one line at a time for what it says. But it
Right,
looks like it's
right,
saying something that it's not saying. But look what it does say. Try it. Go to
right.
it, read it one line at a time, what it said, and it's perfectly fine. It
And,
doesn't
and
say divorce or remarry can go to confession if they're in mortal sin. It says if they're not in mortal sin
right,
and they're in good faith and not in mortal sin, they can go to communion. Well,
right.
what's wrong with that? That's true.
Just
So,
of course
and
it's just good.
it just calls it unusual relationships or some term it used. It doesn't say divorce. It says unusual relationships or something. Well,
Right.
let's read it for what it says. If they're in the state of grace, of course they can go to communion.
Just that, like you said, the mass media blows it out of proportion, and then and then especially if you have more traditional preferences going to the Latin mass. Unfortunately, you see a lot of people there where they're coming down on it. They're much more likely to either question or dissent or one or the other. And
Right.
it's almost not cool to say I assent to Mors Laetitia and Fiducia, which shouldn't matter at all. Obviously, like who cares about being cool? Do you want to be cool
Yeah.
or do you want to be Catholic? Which see do you want to be?
Yeah.
You
Now,
know?
interesting. Fiducia supplicate. Nothing in there is doctrinal. So if we look at Franzelin's infallible safety, nothing falls into that category. Matter of fact, Cardinal Fernandez came out and said there's no doctrinal propositions. There's no doctrinal propositions that require the assent of religious assent according to Franzelin's definition of infallible safety. None of them falls into what he says is infallibly safe. You hear
Oh,
that?
wow.
Nothing in that
Wow.
falls into what he says is infallibly safe. If you look at it in detail, you look at what he says, you look at this, nothing falls into that category because it's practical issues. Practical issues don't fall into what he says. It's just direct doctrinal. A direct doctrinal is I believe X. I believe, not I think it's okay to do. It's I believe this. You see?
Right.
Direct doctrinal, not
Yep.
practical.
That makes sense.
So
And
none of that falls into that infallible safety. Yeah.
and then I guess people look, well, what about the catechism change with the death penalty being inadmissible? But inadmissible is not the same thing as intrinsically evil.
Yeah.
It's a tough. It's you look at it like,
Yeah.
golly, it doesn't sound Catholic, but it is
Yeah.
apparently.
Yeah. I haven't dug into that myself, but the death penalty has always been permitted. The Catechism of Council of Trent even says that it's like obedience to the fifth commandment. The death penalty is obedience to the fifth commandment. I forgot exactly how it works it, but
Yeah.
I haven't dug into that myself. But I'm sure if you dig into it, but again, that's a practical.
Yeah.
See.
And it would see the same thing, and it would seem the same thing with the Latin Mass. As much as I love it and prefer to go to it, as much as I can, my read on Mediator Dei is the language is strong and unequivocal that the Pope has the power to change any of the rites or create new ones, save the substance, of course, can't change the words of consecration or the matter or the form or anything like that. But other than that, it's basically the Pope can do what he wants, regardless of what everyone else would like it to be.
Right. And that comes from Trent too. That comes from Trent Mediator Dei. Yeah, comes from Trent. So yeah. The new mass. I've dug into that also the last couple of years. Really dug into the new mass by looking at the history of the Roman Rite. And really, if you look at the history of the Roman Rite, the new mass is actually closer to the way it was in the early centuries than the traditional mass. It's actually closer. Even communion in the hand. Communion in the hand was the norm. Now, I'm not in favor of communion in the hand. I think that we should not have communion in the hand. It's a bad idea. But in the first 6 centuries, that was the norm. The time of the fathers, that was the norm.
Right.
So the part of the new mass that I always disliked the most was the kiss of peace. You're shaking everyone's hand. And I was reading St. Augustine. He talks about the kiss of peace right there in the same spot. That's comes from the early year. Then I was thinking about it also. Communion, you're uniting. My camera off a little bit. Let's see.
No, you're good. You're good.
The kiss of peace is actually theologically kind of appropriate because you're about to go to communion. At mass, you're kind of in your own little space there. You're praying. But then communion is communion with all the faithful in Christ, all the faithful. So just before that, you kind of greet everyone. So it kind of makes a connection with everyone before you go to communion. So I actually see the part of the new mass that I always dislike the most. I can see how that actually is kind of appropriate because you make a connection with everyone before you go to communion, which is not just with Christ, but it's with, it's also with the others. So I kind of see how that's even kind of appropriate. That kind of struck me about a year ago, how even that part, after reading Augustine especially, is kind of appropriate.
Right. And then people will say it's like, well, the mass wasn't promulgated properly, right? So talk about that. It was de facto promulgated, that the Pope uses that right. So it was implemented in practice. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, what was given the force of law with the new mass is so if you read
because you have something like this. So what is it, like chapter 16 here somewhere?
Yep. If you read what was actually promulgated, Paul gives the force of law. So I give the force of law to all that was set forth in this document. So what was set forth? What was set forth is the words of consecration, that there were 3 new Eucharistic prayers, which are options, and then other things that are kind of vague. So really, it's the words of consecration, the 3 new Eucharistic prayers, which are additional canons that you can choose. But what was set forth is it's interesting. He didn't do what Pius V did. Pius V said, we're promulgating this new, he calls it a new missal. We're promulgating the new missal.
Right.
Paul VI didn't do that. He gave the force of law to what he had mentioned in this letter, Romanum, I can't think of the name.
Well, there was a notification.
Massalia Romanum of April something 1969. So he didn't promulgate the new missal. He gave the force of law to what he had mentioned in that letter. And what he had mentioned is not explicitly the new missal. It's kind of odd. I found that kind of odd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
So, but I don't believe he suppressed. I do not believe he suppressed the traditional mass.
No.
No.
And Benedict XVI said that in Summorum Pontificum.
Yeah.
But there was in the AAS some kind of notification that, you know, the mass in English must now be used, right? And it was my understanding that the 1917 code said what's published in the AAS, yeah, you have to like that's now the ecclesiastical law.
Who signed that thing in the AAS though? Was it from a congregation or was it from the Pope?
I'd have to look at it.
Yes, it's just the official promulgation, but there's more to it than just being promulgated.
Okay.
Congregation, the Pope can approve something from a congregation in forma specifica, where it's the Pope's, or it can just give it common approval.
I'd have to look. Okay.
Yeah, big difference between the two, and it's the terminology that's used. He won't say I'm approving in forma specifica. He'll use certain terminology that lets you know he's approving it that way. So I suspect that if you look at that decree in the AES, it came from a congregation signed by someone other than the Pope, and it was not proved in forma specifica. That's my guess, but I'm open to correction. But check into that.
Yeah. And I was looking up the Pope's response to the dubia to Traditionis Custodes. There was something, and he kept calling it the unique Roman rite, like this, like basically refer. So I mean, it's basically, if people were having a problem misunderstanding, so the Pope's saying it now, but basically there's a refusal to listen. Like a lot of times, a refusal to listen to basically anything that Pope Francis says by their own judgment.
Well, let me also address something else. I can see why Pope Francis would want to suppress the traditional mass. As much as I like the traditional
mass, attitude, because of what we're talking about here.
Because as soon as someone starts going to the traditional mass, now they're thinking, okay, well, I'm a traditional Catholic now. Let me start reading traditional Catholic material, and they get led astray through doctrinal errors, the errors and heresies of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. We ought to have a show on the errors and heresies of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, which no one knows about, but they're legion. The errors of Archbishop Lefebvre are grave and numerous.
Yep.
But no one notices. Why does no one notice? How is it that he can have so many errors and heresies and no one knows? Because if you look at what happens today, if someone comes out and criticizes the Pope, criticizes the church, if they spotlight, people are already kind of frustrated, maybe a little bit irritated. You tap into that and you criticize. That person looked at as a defender of the faith, like Vigano.
Right.
Vigano. Do you know that Vigano? Some things about Vigano real quick. Vigano called Jesus Christ Sol Invictus. Do you know what Sol Invictus is? Yeah. Sol Invictus. Sol Invictus is a false Roman god. You ever heard of that false god that was supposed to be born December 25th, the old Roman god? You ever heard of that one? That's Sol Invictus. Sol Invictus is the false god that the Masons look at as like the bearer of light. Why would Vigano call Jesus Christ Sol Invictus? Here's something else about Vigano. He ends his letters, you got to check the Italian for this. He ends his letters, ready? With the Masonic ritual phrase, so mote it be. Why would Vigano end his letters with the Masonic ritual phrase, so mote it be? Check the Italian, check how he ends his letters. It's translated different in English. Check the Italian, check so mote it be, the Masonic ritual phrase. Why would he end his letters? I can only think of one reason he might do that.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if I'm right or not, but
well, has John said anything? Because obviously John was involved. So he jumped ships, and did he point that out?
I found it.
You found.
I told John about it. He's like, "Whoa, you got to be kidding!" I was like, "No, that's how he ends his letters." So yeah.
Well,
So Vigano is a suspicious character, but he's looked at as a defender of the faith. Why? Is he defending Catholic doctrine? Is he giving profound treatises on this Catholic doctrine being denied? No, he's criticizing the Pope. He's tearing apart the Pope and the church. He set up his own false church, Serge Domine, right? Bringing in who knows how many tens of millions from the Catholics he's leading out of the church. So Vigano is a suspicious character. He's looked at as defender of the faith, though. Again, why? Because he criticizes. Catholics itching ears, they want to hear the church criticized. And you better never try to defend the Pope, because you'll be called a pope-splainer.
Right, exactly.
Now right up there with blasphemy against the Holy Ghost, right? Isn't that one? It's like the worst. I mean, I understand you don't want to defend the indefensible, and I don't either. But a lot of these things are defensible. Even if you defend the defensible, you're looked at as this new sin of pope-splaining, which actually Bellarmine, probably the greatest pope-splainer of all, was Bellarmine. He has a whole book could be called Pope-splaining, where he's defending these popes against things they've done, and some of his arguments are actually so bad. I kind of, when I was reading some of his arguments, like, come on, Bellarmine, just admit it. Just admit what the Pope did. So I get it, not wanting to be a pope-splainer when you're defending the indefensible, but now the Pope can be lied about, and you defend him, and you've committed the evil sin of pope-splaining.
Right. And to bring it back full circle, that's kind of like what you were saying before, why you could understand why Pope Francis, and he said it in his accompanied letter to TC, that basically because of the schismatic attitudes that tend to run in these circles. And that's why I think it's so important getting the message out, especially if we like the Latin Mass, because we'll end up losing it, and it'll be our own fault. And it'll be my fault because I imbibed that for 4 years and gave the wrong information to a ton of people. Not a ton, but quite a few.
I was in the same mindset. I had this again. I had the mentality. So I understand it. I had the mentality. I'm not judging. I had the mentality myself. I was there, but I see through it now. So, now I'm trying to look back. How did I not see it before? How did I not see it? And it's hard to understand how I didn't see it.
But I think it's starting out of order a lot of times when we start with the crisis, or we start of necessity, or we start, can the Pope be a manifest heretic? Whoa. Let's start with what is the church that Jesus Christ established, and then that's mile 20 in the marathon. Let's start with mile 1.
Another thing, just switching gears a little bit, is that the Sedevacantists think that if he's not the Pope, well, that means basically there's no more church. No. When the Pope dies, what happens? You're still going to your parish church. You still have all those dioceses, you and the Church of Rome.
The structure is still there. You've said this before.
That's it. Structure's still there. Well, they think if there's no Pope, well, I guess I can go, start my own sect over here. No. Structure is still there. That's what they implicitly believe. I know the Sedevacantists like the back of my hand. That's what they implicitly believe. That's Mario Dirksen, Novus Ordo Watch. He joined a sect that was founded by an anti-pope. Became anti-pope afterwards, Francis Schuchert. He was anti-pope Hadrian VII. He founded the sect that Mario Dirksen belongs to. Mario Dirksen thinks he's a Catholic. He belongs to a non-Catholic sect.
Right.
Founded by he was a homosexual anti-pope. He was sexually abusing his seminarians. They finally had a big split, like they always do. But I mean, he just, again, I don't know how they can't see it.
Oh, I know.
And the Diamond Brothers, they belong to Most Holy Family Monastery. You heard of that?
Oh yeah.
Monastery. It's never been part. It's not part of the Catholic Church. Never has been part of the Catholic Church. It was founded by Joseph Natali, a layman.
Right.
They're not Catholics. They've never been Catholics. They belong to they're basically Protestants who like the traditional mass. Protestants claim to adhere to the Bible. There's two fonts of revelation: Scripture, tradition. The Protestants claim to adhere to the Bible, which they didn't. The so-called traditionalists claim to adhere to tradition, which they don't. It's just two different exact same.
But they're missing the third leg, the magisterium, which is the safeguard. That's it. And the principle, and the Pope, the principle of unity that Vatican I says, which I've heard people say that a lot of times the traditionalists think they have a Vatican II problem. They actually have a Vatican I problem.
Yeah. They have a church problem. They're not part of the government.
Right. Exactly. So what's the deal? These guys, the Diamond Brothers, won't debate you?
I'd love to debate them. I'd love to. Yeah. Maybe we will have a debate with them. I'm going to invite them on. Me and Sauls are about to start our podcast. We've been planning it for a while. His tax season is almost up, April 15th. So we're going to have a podcast. So we'll invite them on. Or we could invite on your show any priest in tradition.
I'd be more than happy to.
Wants to debate collegiality. Any priest, Father Albert, who's been on the Fatima Center. Father Albert, let's have a discussion on collegiality. Father Tranquillo, anyone wants to discuss collegiality, let's have a discussion.
Right.
Collegiality is 100% traditional. Matter of fact, the society priests, I think, know it. I've sent enough emails. I've had enough email exchanges with them. I'm pretty sure they now realize collegiality is totally traditional. Archbishop Lefebvre was dead wrong. But what are they going to do? Are they going to come out and say Archbishop Lefebvre deceived us?
Right.
They
Well,
can't. They're
no,
stuck.
no, and that's yeah, and they are because and as Archbishop Lefebvre, like you said, this would be the topic, this beyond the scope of this show, but we should definitely do another one, the errors of Archbishop Lefebvre, and also how he changed his mind at different times, and that's why there's a resistance group because they're holding to the Lefebvre of the most recent Lefebvre. But like,
Right.
which Lefebvre are you going to follow?
Exactly.
The one who signed the documents, the one who wrote the letter to Cardinal Ratzinger and JP2 in 1983, or the one in 1985, or his
Yeah.
position before he died in 1990 or 91,
The
right?
Lefebvre who said he would never consecrate a bishop without a papal mandate in 83, or the one that did it in 88. So yeah.
And then or the one who did dialogue with Rome, or the one at the end who said no discussion with Rome, and that's exactly why the resistance broke off. Yeah, like I said, we could do. Well, I'm happy to do another show with that for sure.
Yeah.
But no,
A
it's
debate, but just not a debate, just discussion, not debate.
yeah,
Just any
we got to
priest or
talk.
bishop.
Yeah,
While I'm
and
out,
this,
before we go, let me also explain the errors of Bishop Sanborn.
please, yeah,
Bishop Sanborn, the sedeprivationists heresy.
yeah,
Okay?
yeah,
This is got to be the most ridiculous heresy that's come about in the last 2,000 years, but no one understands it. That's why they buy into it.
right,
So here's sedeprivationism. Sanborn admits the Novus Ordo is the church. He admits that much. That's good. Now, of course, he's not part of that church, which is another problem he doesn't seem to realize. But so what he says is that okay, we talked about so the structure of the church, right?
Sure. Mhm.
Ordinary jurisdiction, just like the president of the United States, when he assumes office, he assumes the powers of the office, right?
Right,
President Trump, because the powers are attached to the office. So they're already
right,
there. Whoever assumes the office acquires the authority of the office. It's the
right,
same thing with particular churches. They're established by the Pope and they have certain powers attached to them. When he appoints a bishop to that office, he assumes the authority of that office, just like the president. Okay. So Bishop Sanborn says, in order to acquire those powers of the office, you have to have the intention of promoting the common good. Not only that, you have to have you have to intend to promote the common good. And then what you intend to do also has to objectively promote the common good. If you lack that intention, then you might hold the office, but you don't have the authority of the office. That's sedeprivationism. What's the problem with it? The church has never taught you have to have any intention of promoting the common good. That's a novelty that was invented by Gerard de Laurier. You don't have to have any intention. If you hold the office legally, you have the powers of the office. So two errors. One, he says you have to have that intention to promote the common good. Second error, Bishop Sanborn, who couldn't name 99% of these bishops, claimed to have judged that none of them had the intention to promote the common good when they were appointed to office. Therefore, he says none of them have authority because none of them had the intention. How does he know? Somehow he judges that. So two errors. One, you have to have intention of promoting the common good. Church is never taught. Two, he judges that somehow he seems to know that none of them had that intention when they're appointed to office. Therefore, none of them have authority. So the structure's still there. It's a true church, but none of the bishops have the authority of the office, including the Pope, because they lack the intention. That's sedeprivation. It's complete nonsense. But it's presented in this intellectual way. They use traditional terms. Wow, a traditional term, it's got to be true,
right.
A Latin term. Latin terms got to be true. So that's it. That's sedeprivation. It's complete nonsense, totally untraditional, never been taught. It's a novelty of Gerard de Laurier, who died excommunicated, by the way. So that's sedeprivationism.
And how in the world would that not make the church? How would that jive with indefectibility? I mean,
Exactly.
just ask any common just a common person. It's like, okay, maybe you don't have the theological terms, but how are you going to look me in the face and say you believe we have a magisterium, but I don't have to listen to anything they say?
Not only that, how the church can't carry out its mission without authority. It needs the authority to teach, govern, and think by. He says there is no authority in the church. So Bishop Sanborn needs to wake up and realize that's a completely absurd. But the problem is they can't, because they reject doctrine. See, they reject collegiality. He rejects the doctrines of the church, and so he's forced to try to explain how the church could have taught these doctrines that he rejects. The doctrines are true. The problem is on his part, not on the part of the church.
Right. And that's huge because when you look at it, like you said, with these different groups and these different people, there's doctrinal issues. And at first, that sounds maybe weird or jarring to hear a Pope splainer accuse them of a doctrinal error, but that's exactly what it is.
Absolutely.
And it's a massive one because Christ spoke a lot about unity. Unity was one of the primary messages of
Yes,
Jesus Christ.
absolutely. Yeah, it's the form of the church. The form you have, matter, form, efficient cause, final
Right.
cause. The form is unity. That's the form of the church.
And the
So,
Pope's the principle of unity
right, yeah.
by Vatican I, not Vatican II.
Yeah, so you have the form is unity, material cause are the Catholics. So the Catholics in unity are the church.
Right.
That's the church. Those in unity under the Pope in that structure. When there's no Pope, the church is still indefectible, right?
Right.
So,
Because the structure is still there.
but
Oh,
Holy
that's
Ghost is still the efficient cause of indefectibility, even when there's no Pope.
right. Right. Oh, that's awesome. Great talk, Robert. Really great. And I'd love to have you back on again. We could do another one, any topic you'd like. So
Okay.
where could people find you and get more information?
True or false Pope. That's our website. I haven't been posting there lately, but I'll be posting more articles recently, and me and Saz will have our podcast started pretty soon.
Awesome. We want to send people your way. Thank you
Okay.
very much for all the work you do. Like I said, especially the people who love tradition and the Latin Mass should really gravitate towards this because this is the kind of thing that's going to help save that.
Not only traditional Latin Mass, but also the church.
Most
And the
important.
church
Most
needs
important.
right now. The church needs defenders. There's
Most importantly.
very few defenders of the church right now.
Right.
That's what it needs.
And thanks to the coherent arguments and how you and John Sals have gone public with this and opened up and said, hey, I was down this road. I know where you're at. I was wrong. Here's the missteps. We're not judging you personally, but hey, this information you have to update your thinking. I do believe there will be a massive exodus outside of these traditional movements because now the information is coming to light. So thank you for all that you do.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you too.
All right.
All right.